So let's talk through a quick guide on how to write a Warhammer 40k army list and the practicalities of organising your miniatures into a functional fighting force on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about writing a Warhammer 40k army list, perhaps something that's kind of intuitive to people who are already well established in the hobby, but maybe not the most obvious thing in the world to newer players. In the previous edition of the game, the nuts and bolts of the process was certainly a lot more complicated, and while 10th edition does make a lot of things super simple, there's still a fair few things that are less obvious or might trip a newer player up. Plus, the freedom of army building can be a little bit on the overwhelming side, not really knowing which units to go for in what combinations. Perhaps the best place to start with writing a 40k army list in 10th edition is Games Workshop's flowchart, a rough overview of how you put an army together on the table. First, you need to know what sort of mission or match that you're playing. Find somewhere to write down your army list, whether it's an app or a piece of paper or whatever. Choose the faction in Warhammer 40k that you're playing with and which detachment within that faction you're using. Choose the actual units that you're playing in game, and there's a fair few quirks as to what you can and can't pick in certain combinations, and then nominate one unit to lead your army and maybe enhance some of your other characters with certain upgrades. Going through the process, and first up you certainly need to know what sort of game you're playing. In more standard versions of Warhammer 40k, people tend to play at either Incursion, Strike Force or Onslaught mode, 1000, 2000 or 3000 points respectively. The points value basically denoting how many models you can take in the game. Bigger and scarier models with more power generally cost more points. A lot of the more standard games of 40k use the mission deck. There are plenty of other missions that you can play in the game though, and there's other 40k game modes in general, with Crusade for narrative play, Combat Patrol for fixed armies straight from the box, and some more 40k but indoor skirmish games called Boarding Patrol. In this video we're going to be focusing on core Warhammer 40k, though all of these modes are interesting in their own way. For the most part though, when you know what sort of mission that you're playing and what sort of points limit you're playing with, you can start building your army with that context. Then the next step is to choose your faction and your detachment. The faction is usually going to be very obvious, that's the army that you're playing. Your faction keyword is found in the bottom right of each datasheet within your army. You might have Orcs or Thousand Sons or Adepts Astartes, which is the keyword for Space Marines in general. Generally speaking, all the units in your army list need to share this faction keyword to be allowed to be included in your army. Though there might be certain allied units that are exceptions to this. They've got their own clear rules in each individual index or codex, and we'll cover them later. Then, after you've picked your faction, then you choose your detachment. Detachments in Warhammer 40k are basically the flavours of army that you're playing within that faction. So for example, Space Marines have this Gladius task force that represents a fairly tactically balanced force of Space Marines engaging with the enemy, maybe something to the similar sort of flavour of a battle company or what the Ultramarines might like to field. And that unlocks certain special rules like this Combat Doctrines rule. Other armies have their own, such as the Astra Militarum Combined Regiment or the Tyranids Invasion Swarm. Most of the armies with indexes in 40k will only have the choice of one of these at launch, so no real choice at all. The only armies that do have some choice are things like Dark Angels and Blood Angels and the other Divergent Space Marines. They can currently choose between their own unique detachment and the Gladius Task Force from core Space Marines. As the codexes roll out and Games Workshop releases one for each faction, each army will have the choice of several different detachments, so different ways to play. The Tyranids will get detachments based around monsters or infiltrating units, and the Space Marines will get a first company detachment. In 40k, the detachments give you all the rest of the special rules for your army. They give you a detachment rule like these Combat Doctrines that affect every Space Marine in the army, and give them some powerful boosts like being able to advance and shoot. As well as that, you get a bunch of unique stratagems, often 6, and a set of unique enhancements to make your characters better that you pay for in points, and we'll get to in just a second. So now we've chosen our faction and the detachment for the faction. They'll give us the core rules that we're playing with, and then you actually need to start adding units to your army, each one having a points cost for how much of your points allowance it will take up and how many things you can field. These are found in the Munitorum Field Manual download from the Warhammer community webpage. Head to Downloads and Warhammer 40,000 under that section, and then you'll find the points cost presented in tables like this, headed by faction and in alphabetical order for the units within. You then combine this with the actual rules for the army that you've got, either from the index data cards or your codex when they're out. The index data cards basically have two different sides on them, one side an in-game side, and the other side a more army construction type side. That tells you how many models that you can have in the unit and what sort of war gear options they're allowed to take. Unlike previous editions of Warhammer 40k, the options for points of a unit are very straightforward now. Lots of units will just have one line, and that denotes how many points it is for the models that you can take. Some might have the option of bigger or smaller squads. Say, for example, the Cerberus Raiders for the Adeptus Mechanicus. They can be taken in squad sizes of 3 or squad sizes of 6, either 75 points for 3 of them or 150 for 6. Technically, as per the rules, you can field, say, a squad of 4 or 5, but it generally will be suboptimal, as you'd still have to pay for the higher points cost if you're doing so. So you'd be paying more points but not getting as many models. Occasionally it could be useful though, say if you need to cram a squad into a transport and there's not enough room for an attached character or something. Also, unlike previous editions of Warhammer 40k, every single war gear option is included in this points cost as well, so you could upgrade these guys with a data tether and it wouldn't cost you any extra. The same is true of all options across the game now, so a lot of the time for squads with flexible war gear options, it often makes sense to just take the biggest and most exciting weapons and guns. Again, with the current point system, it can make a few things a bit suboptimal, say for example equipping all of you guys with just basic rifles if they do have the option to take bigger, fancier, heavy weapons. As you're adding units to your army like this, you can either just add them up manually and make a note on paper, or use a Word or Excel document or something. There are plenty of list building apps that exist as well. Warhammer 40k's app is currently free at time of recording, but they will paywall this in the not too distant future. That does seem to work at least fairly well though. And also there's the popular community option, Battle Scribe. Can be an easy way to mess around with units as you add and subtract them, though often the data can lag a little bit behind when Games Workshop actually makes big releases like 10th edition, as the people who import the data have to manually compile it. However you're choosing to record things, basically from then on you just keep on adding units to your army until you've run out of points, though there are a few restrictions to doing so, and you can't just say take 100% of one thing that you like. First up, every army must include at least one character datasheet. The main reason for this is that each army must have a designated warlord to lead the army, mainly because it comes up for certain rules issues, like say certain objectives might score you more points if you manage to slay the enemy warlord. Otherwise, for most units in your army, you can take 0 to 3 of any datasheets in any combination pretty much. Again, unlike previous editions, there's no restriction on things like unit types or battlefield roles, so say if you wanted to take an entire army full of heavy tanks and one character, you certainly could do so if you wanted to. Sometimes very skewed lists like that can be powerful, though often it makes sense to have a bit more of a mix to cover your bases in different battlefield situations. Otherwise, beyond most units, some units have the battle line keyword, which you can usually take 0 to 6 of, so you can take a few more in your army. These are things like common troops, like say the Adeptus Sororitas Battle Sister Squad, or Chaos Space Marine Legionaries that you might see a lot of in an army. Dedicated transports also have slightly more relaxed restrictions as well. You can take anywhere between 0 to 6 of those. So say for Space Marines you could have an army with 6 Rhino tanks in it if you'd like to. So the main restriction on them is they have a very punishing rule that if you don't start a unit inside them, the transport counts as destroyed instantly, so basically you have to do that. It means that if you are spamming dedicated transports, they do actually need to have units that can ride in them. You can't just take 6 empty ones, say for example if you wanted a whole load of random empty hulls running around the board getting in the way of your opponents. Finally, for main unit restrictions, epic heroes are limited to just one datasheet each. These are basically your named characters in Warhammer 40k, things like Rebute Gilliman or Cato Sicarius, and they do cover a fair few non-named things as well, say for example Vindicare Assassins or the Avatar of Cain, things you might only expect to have one of in an army. You can run multiple epic heroes, you just can't run more than one copy of the same thing. So say you could have Rebute Gilliman and Cato Sicarius in an army, but you can't have 2 copies of Rebute Gilliman because there's only one. If you follow those rules though, you basically can construct an army more or less however you like. Just another couple of things might get in the way for certain things though. Detachments might specify that you can't take certain units in that detachment. Say for example, you can't run a Tau army with Commander Farsight and Ethereals in the same army list, as they don't get on. Space Marines can't mix epic heroes from different chapters, so no Gilliman and the Lion in the same army list unfortunately. And other rules might just flat lock out certain units. Say for example, the Black Templars can't field Librarians, as they don't use Psychers. As you're building your list, you might want to add certain characters who might be leading units, or just taking the fight to the enemy on their own. Lots of these can be really quite powerful, and generic characters that aren't epic heroes, they're basically the only units in 40k that can actually take an upgrade that costs points, and those upgrades are called Enhancements. They basically replace old school warlord traits and relics. You can only find them in your detachments, there aren't any generic ones from the core book or anything like that, and the rule is that you can upgrade up to 3 of your characters with enhancements per army, so you won't be able to take all the ones that you have on offer in your detachments. Say for example the Astra Militarum have access to these 4 enhancements. If you wanted, you could give this Cadian Castellan the Grand Strategist enhancement. That one costs an extra 15 points, and just allows him to issue another order to a different guard squad. Epic heroes aren't allowed to take these, so you couldn't say give an enhancement to Ursula Creed, and as fairly small low points cost things, they can be kind of useful to fill out the last few points in your army list if you don't quite have enough to afford another unit. In general, that's the gist of how you put Warhammer 40k armies together. You really have quite a lot of freedom and can pick pretty much what datasheets you'd like. Some have a few restrictions, and you can upgrade characters with enhancements. I would say there's a fair few rules of thumb that you could roughly follow though when you're building army lists, obviously changing very heavily army to army, but quite a few factions might like to get their hands on some of these if they can. First up, I'd say that covering multiple aspects of your army would be really quite good if you've got the option to. You're certainly going to need some mainline damage dealers that can actually take chunks out of the enemy army very efficiently, often dangerous elites with power weapons and things, or big scary tanks or heavy weapons with massive guns. Some armies tend to do those that just pop up and then destroy something but are quite fragile. Some armies might have mighty units that can both give and take a punch. In general, even if you don't have things that are both mighty and dangerous, a few tough things to stand on objectives isn't the worst idea. Say a big horde of Gretchen could be kind of annoying to take down for enemy anti-infantry weapons because they're just more bodies than there are shots, so they might be able to somewhat reliably hold a point even if they're out in the open and exposed to damage. Having some screening and nuisance units is pretty handy, maybe scouts and infiltrators to take the mid-board early, hold back the enemy and get on objectives quickly. A few fast movers in an army can help out quite a bit, either having the mobility to charge down certain enemy units or get line of sight or damage things. It can be really quite big if you've got the movements to reach a unit the opponent really didn't want you to, and these units are also pretty great for scooting around the board, scoring points on missions. Beyond all that, Warhammer 40k often has lots of synergy units going on, say a character that can be a bit of a force multiplier to a squad and make them far more dangerous than they would have been if you just bought more guys, or perhaps things that can impact multiple units in your army, say marking a target enemy unit for a +1 to hit for the rest of your forces. Most armies have some sort of characters or other units that can help out like that, and they tend to be good, but perhaps something that you need to take in at least somewhat small numbers, as they don't generally have the damage and defense themselves to carry the battle. For example, for characters, maybe a typical Warhammer 40k army might be fielding somewhere around 3 to 5 leader or support characters at 2000 points. Some could definitely go heavier than this, but a lot of the time it just doesn't make sense to, as they don't really add much defense to your army, and their own personal damage might not be that exciting either. It's a bit of a balance of having characters to boost units and also having numbers of units to lead. Often there can be a bit of an incentive to spam multiple copies of one unit as well, say if one unit's just very good. That definitely can have its rewards. Say for example if your opponent had enough anti-tank guns to kill 1 tank a turn, then having 4 tanks to deal with is going to be much more of a problem than just 2. But on the other hand, in 10th edition 40k, lots of units have really quite powerful individual rules on their datasheets, particularly the things that either buff the rest of your army or debuff certain enemy units could encourage you to have multiple different datasheets, just so you can literally access their datasheet abilities, and in certain matchups they could be really effective. Perhaps one example could be Tyranid Barbgorns. They have a fairly powerful rule to slow down enemy infantry units. They might not be relevant in every single game, but it certainly could be worth having one unit of them about, as they give you a massive boost in a matchup where you've got to fight enemy infantry. Perhaps another thing that's worth touching on as well is allies in 10th edition. Again, as a bit of a difference to previous versions of Warhammer 40k, most of the time you can't just take 2 different factions and ally them together, even if they are factions that traditionally get on, like say Space Marines and Imperial Guard, although certain combos are allowed, usually with some restrictions. When you field allied armies, generally you'll have your main faction, and then the allied things will be added in as extras. For them you just use your datasheets, and they can't access other rules from their detachments or anything like that. You just literally get your data cards and pretty much nothing else. For the Imperium, some of the most common examples are Imperial Knights. You can ally 1 allied Titanic Knight or up to 3 armigers. That means most armies in the game can access some big heavy guns and some fairly threatening vehicles. Imperium can also ally Imperial Agents as well, up to 1 character and 1 retinue unit per every 1000 points that you have. Say for example at 2000 points you could take an Assassin, an Inquisitor, and 2 units of Adeptus Arbites. For the Chaos, they perhaps have even more freeform allied rules. Chaos Demons can be included as a quarter of your army in any of the other Chaos factions, though a few of them are locked to Mono God, World Eaters like Khorne, and Thousand Suns like Tzeentch. Emperor's Children via Lucis the Eternal leading your army. They're locked to Slanesh demons. The Chaos Knights basically have the same rule as the Imperials, 1 allied Titanic Knights, or up to 3 allied War Dogs. And for Codex Chaos Space Marines in particular, they can just take a few individual datasheets, Plague Marines, Khorne Berserkers, and Rupert Marines out of the various more divergent Chaos Legions, which I guess is technically like allies on a very low level. Otherwise, for the Xenos, the Genestealer cult can take a quarter of their army as Astra Militarum from a limited set of units. The Drukhari can take a quarter of their army as either Harlequins or Eldar Corsairs, and the Inari are based around the Eldari Codex. If you take Ivrain to lead your army, they can take half their datasheets as Drukhari ones if they'd like. Fairly freeform mixing there. It's definitely not something that you have to take in an army. They won't have quite as much synergy with your main force, but being able to basically cherry pick as many of your favourite datasheets from certain codexes seems really quite a powerful thing for the armies that are able to. Finally, here's just one example of a Warhammer 40k army list. Nothing supposed to be super optimal or anything like that, but just a rough idea of how you could put an army together. The faction being used here is the Astra Militarum with the Combined Regiment Detachment, and I have chosen to take some allied units along, Canis Rex from the Imperial Knights, and a Vindicare Assassin from the Imperial Agents Index. Going through the list, we've got Lord Solar Leontus, the faction commander pretty much. He can attach to one of the infantry squads and hand out some very flexible orders, either to them or the tanks, and he also generates command points for the army. Ursula Creed can maybe attach to the Cadian shock troops, and again is very handy to have nearby for stratagems being free. Finally, for characters, we've also got a Deathcore Marshal with Curovus Aquila. He's a datasheet from the Imperial Armor Compendium for the Astra Militarum. He can make one of the Deathcore squads a lot tougher, and he's got the enhancement the Curovus Aquila, which makes one stratagem more expensive for your opponent after they've used it once. For some big squads to be kind of durable in the midfield and screen out the damage dealers, we've got 2 units of the Deathcore of Krieg, both with 20 models in them, and 130 points each for those. They take grenade launchers, melter guns, plasma guns, and power weapons in there, and there's a somewhat similar big squad of Cadian shock troops as well, 20 points as well. There's a small squad of Ratlings to deploy in the midfield and hopefully get some presence on the midfield objectives and do some annoying sniping. And then most of the rest of the list is vehicles, 2 individual Scout Sentinels with las cannons, Sentinel chainsaws, and Hunter Killer missiles. Really quite efficient units all round and are able to mark targets for the artillery and the rest of the army, so have some synergy as well. And then there's a further big unit of them with 3 of the same build for 150 points. They could be quite nice units to use that reinforcement stratagem on, to basically bring them back from the dead when they're killed the first time. Then for some mainline damage dealers, we're just going for the straightforward Lehman Ross battle tank. They're upgraded with some multi-melter sponsons, a las cannon on the hull, a heavy stubber on the top hatch, and a hunter killer missile. Really quite a lot of guns there and some big rerolls against enemies on objectives. And then to support them, we've got a Hydra to deal with some anti-air things, and to ignore line of sight basilisks, putting some big Earthshaker shells on units out of line of sight. If you do have access to some efficient ignores line of sight shooting in a 40k army list, can definitely be worth throwing a bit in, as it can be a really big deal if your opponent hides something crucial. Finally, for allied units, we've got the Imperial Knight Freeblade Canis Rex, really quite a big stompy walker to support the guard advance there, and a Vindicare Assassin to maybe perch on a high ruin and try and pick off enemy characters and leaders right out of their units with precision. Overall, not really trying to do anything particularly clever with this one. I'm sure guard lists at time of recording will probably be using a lot more artillery than this, but I feel like it's got a somewhat reasonable balance of damage dealers, units to hold objectives, and a few utility things like some forward deployment and scout moving things, plus a lot of advantages with the command point and stratagem game. In any case, hope that's been at least somewhat helpful to some of you, perhaps a little bit clearer as to how you might put a Warhammer 40k army list together in the 10th edition of the game. Feel free to share any other things that you think I've missed or glossed over, and any particular tricks with building armies down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and if you'd like to check out other similar things to this, then I have made a How to Play 10th Edition 40k series. I'll leave the playlist to that linked in the video description below. Otherwise, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's the thing that allows me to keep quite so many videos like this coming pretty much every day. If you have been enjoying a lot on the channel, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.